is because during Easter is a time where those of the Christian faith gather in huge numbers as they remember the dying of Christ on the cross and his resurrection. This being the weekend that particular part of the Bible is fulfilled in terms of remembrance, but it was empty. An empty tomb, as it has been put here by the Standard, and empty churches on Easter Sunday. Again, this, of course, is in adherence to government restrictions and advisory by Ministry of Health to ensure that there is no gathering and that social distancing is maintained. So the churches remained empty apart from a few preachers and maybe worship leaders who are in church to ensure that the live streaming church, church services continued. But we also saw a different kind of bravery that was, seen by some Christians. And these are some who literally went into the streets of Nairobi to pray for the end of this particular pandemic, the coronavirus COVID-19. Only a handful of worshippers stand up for prayers in keeping with the ban on social gathering as Christians marked the holiest event in the Bible. And that is on page 3 and on page 4. On page 5 of the Standard, we also have empty pews and dry coffers as pandemic hits churches. Again, this is a time where not just in Kenya, but even world over, you have churches filling up at this particular season, given that it is one of the most, if not the most important part of the calendar of a Christian, and this is the dying and resurrection of Christ, this being the weekend where it is marked. But that also means there was a very, very huge hit on the income for churches, and this particular story on page 5 of the Standard is highlighting some churches, not just in Kenya, but even world over, that this weekend would have been a time where they somehow try and recover their financial deficit over the year by, strength of the fact that many Christians would gather and give towards, this kind of weekend. But that did not happen. On page 6, how correct are COVID-19 numbers bandied around? And this again is focusing on some of the numbers we've been given. Remember, we are using as a country, and the Ministry of Health continues to use statistics that they have gathered from other countries in regards to how we expect the spread of the coronavirus COVID-19 to take place and what is expected. They're projections that have been used. But now questions are being asked as to how accurate these numbers that we're using are so far. And this is, of course, we were expecting by the end of April, if we're to go by this particular numbers that had been given, to hit even 10,000 cases. But that, of course, has not been the case so far. Questions are being raised on the models used to predict COVID-19 cases, even as the Health Ministry defends its projections. A month since the first case was reported on March 13th, and almost 2 weeks into April, Kenya's numbers are barely 250,000 initially projected as an estimate for this time. Of course, if they're accurate, then that is good news for us, because really, we're not looking forward to having that many numbers, given that it's really going to be a strain on our health system. And one still wonders whether we are prepared, particularly on the county level, to handle huge cases of COVID-19. But if these figures are accurate, that is good news. However, the bad side of it is, if they're not accurate, then we could be having less numbers than what we actually have, and at some point then there could be an explosion of the numbers, and that of course would throw us into a mental tailspin, and that would leave us at a very, very bad position. So far, just to give you a breakdown of the numbers that we have, county number 47, that's Nairobi, we have 97 cases, Kakamega 2 cases, Kitui 1 case, Wasingishu 1 case, Mandera 2 cases, and get yourself a copy of the Standard, particularly to follow up on what the numbers we have so far according to the Ministry of Health, and that also helps you understand and know why it is necessary for us to stay home and stay safe. And if you must come out, then follow the guidelines and restrictions that have been given, and those include wearing a mask, making sure that you sanitize, you wash your hands, but also The use of private vehicles and public vehicles have also got restrictions. Remember, we now are only allowed to have 50%, not more than 50% capacity of your private vehicle. So if your car is a 5-seat carrier, for example, you cannot have 3 people in that car. You can only take 2 and even maintain social distancing. And of course, I've had some people question the logic and say, well, we're coming from the same house, and as a result, then what does it matter even if we are 5 people who have come from the same house in the same car? Of course, these are questions that continue to be asked, but the Ministry of Health has gone through those and advised as to why that continues. Page 7 of the Standard: no washing of bodies before burial, Muslim scholars rule. This is another area, of course, that has been affected, and that's the area of gathering while we conduct burials. And remember, even over the weekend, something which maybe I'm going to highlight as I look through the nation, there was controversy of a body that was buried at 2 a.m. And this, of course, was in an undignified manner. But before I get to that, there is this particular article on the Standard where Muslims have been advised, according to the restrictions and guidelines given again by Ministry of Health, that some of the cultural and religious practices that we are used to may have to be revised, particularly at this time. And with the Muslim faith, it is normally part of their tradition and custom to wash a body with water before it is cremated or buried, and as a result, this has been revised. They have issued new guidelines on the funeral rite known as ghusl, forgive me if I pronounce it wrong, which now makes it permissible to bury a body without washing it with water and shrouding it, to perform the alternative ritual of which it is purified with sand or dust is used instead. So an interesting article there of the times that we are living in. And one thing we must agree and admit as a community, as a society, as a world, as humanity, is that times have changed. And many things may never ever go back to the way they were. This is definitely a turning point in many ways. Page 9 is that story that I referred to earlier. Sad tale of virus victim buried without a coffin. And this is James Onyango, who was buried at night under the watchful eye of police and public health officers. There were videos that were doing rounds as to how he was buried, literally in a body bag and thrown into a very shallow pit without a coffin, and questions being raised as to why that would have been done. A very undignified manner, particularly those, particularly in terms of the African culture. There is a way that we respect the dead even as you bury them, but this seemed not to have been done. So a suspected COVID-19 victim who died in Siaya was hurriedly buried at night in the bizarre ceremony that left villagers in shock. Another question, of course, that is being raised over this particular case is that his COVID-19 status being positive was discovered after his death, and of course then that raises the question of follow-up of some of the people that he interacted with, given that he actually traveled the day before he passed away. And of course now the government has a humongous task of trying to trace some of the people that he probably interacted with so that they can go through the procedure of isolation, quarantine, testing, and eventually hopefully if they are negative, they will then after 14 days be allowed to continue with their life. But if found positive, of course, then again, the normal procedure to be followed. On page 11 of the Standard, Mudavadi joins calls to save Kenyans stranded in China. Another story that has been doing rounds on social media, with Kenyans, of course, up in arms, asking what is government doing to ensure that those Kenyans who are in China and have had a very tough time by virtue of the fact there's discrimination according to what they say. What is government doing? So Amani National Congress leader Musalia Mudavadi yesterday piled pressure on the government to evacuate Kenyans who are stranded in China. Of course, the question has been raised as to how they're going to come home, given that there are flight restrictions. But we've seen countries like the UK, for instance, sending aircrafts that are empty to countries just to evacuate their people. So this is something that Kenya could consider doing. He made demands against the backdrop of reports that individuals of African origin were being ejected from their residential houses over COVID-19 infection fears. This, of course, again exposes them to even even more danger. And there could be that question of what happens if they come and they're positive. I think the Ministry of Health, again, has put very, very clear directions and instructions of what would happen if somebody comes from outside the country. There is a procedure to be followed, and that starts by, first of all, of course, isolating them and putting them in isolation centers, which the government has already put in place. And once they're in these isolation centers, then they will go through the usual testing and staying in those isolation centers for 14 days, which after, if they're proved to be negative, they can be released to continue and go and join the rest of society. If found positive, then again, there is a procedure that is followed until they have fully recovered. And of course, the prayer is that they fully recover. There you go. So page 19 of the Standard is a story that we also featured not too long ago. Sex worker tortured and killed in her house by assailants. COVID-19 drives women to old ways of birthing is also a story given there. And there is a lady, Elena Kachike, who attends to Jedida Lolwe, who is expecting, but again, given that there's restriction of movement, hospitals are also under a lot of stress in regards to having their staff concentrating on COVID-19. Emergency, things that are not viewed to be emergency services are possibly being put to other ways of being used, and that, of course, being traditional methods that can be seen. There's also an interesting story here of a gentleman who says, I beat cancer but cannot come back home. Again, that's on page, it's in the Pullout magazine of The Standard this morning. Let us also look at the Daily Nation before we wind up. And on the headline of the Daily Nation, virus, Kenya faces a tough second month and make or break period. This again being a time that is going to tip the scales one way or the other. Kenyans could be in for a rude shock if infections and mortality patterns mirror those countries like US and Spain, which started off with a few confirmed cases before witnessing an explosion. Again, this puts the question of the numbers that we're using, but also the methods that have been used to see how this is being done. So virus, Kenya faces a tough second month, and this could be a make or break. Restrictions have been put in place. Ministry of Health has made it very clear, giving us daily updates on the situation and also advisory on what we need to do. Question is, do Kenyans follow this advice, or do they take it to be more or less just government trying to crack the whip on something that is non-existent? I've actually had some people have discussions and say that there is nothing like COVID-19, which of course would be ridiculous given that this is a pandemic that has hit the world, and I'm not sure what one would be expecting to hear for them to believe that it is actually real. All right, on page 3, there's a story, double blow for grieving kid in Siaya man's hurried burial. This again is that gentleman, James Oyugi Onyango, who died and was buried very unceremoniously in an undignified manner at 2 a.m. in the morning, with authorities ensuring that people did not attend this particular funeral. And of course, the Keenan family feeling very, very, very disrespected, so to speak. And the story is right there on page 3 of The Nation this morning. Kenya faces tough second month in its battle against the virus. This again is as we reflect and see how things have changed. And this particular story is also looking at how Easter was held in many churches and many Christian centers where normally you'd be bustling. It would be a bustle of activity. But this Easter was different. Why? Because there are those restrictions in place, and as a result, there are very few people who would probably be there just to ensure that their online stream service would be taking place, but majority of the people watching from home as advised by government. What curfew? It's party after party as Kenyans trick the system. And this is actually an entry to our discussion this morning, and also the basis for our question this morning, where we're asking, do you think the recently imposed measures restricting inter-county travel by government are effective. Do you think they're effective? This particular story here in the nationwide curfew, it's party after party. We have a Limuru magistrate